Teleclass is about the 7 pitfalls to avoid when producing humus compost. And this comes from us getting this experience over the last 30 years of just continually hammering in these different principles. And a different way to look at it is if we can correct these often parts of pitfalls, we can end up making quality humus compost. So the first one is improper ingredients, as well as improper preparation of ingredients. Now, incidentally, each one of those will make the same end result. So it's very critical that we understand it. So I'm going to start with improper ingredients first. And that's what all newcomers coming to the composting arena seem to think about and focus on, but they really often miss that last one. So we'll talk about each one. The improper ingredients has to do with, let's say, for example, that we have too much carbon and not enough nitrogen material. That seems to be something that everyone readily identifies with. But how about having too much nitrogen material and not enough carbon? That is something that's not as readily something that everyone identifies with, but both are a factor. Both are important that we balance that. And the second thing to that is if we have enough carbon according to our CN ratios of ingredients, but some of those carbons, for example, in very hardwood or woody materials, some of those wood materials do not actually break down. So for all intents and purposes, for the sake of the windrow, it's like they're not there. So even if the lab says that your ratio and the recipe software tells you that you're right at 30-1, which is kind of what you want in your effective CN ratio, you may decide that, wait a minute, I bet you that 5 or 10 of these 30 pieces of carbon are not even becoming a reaction in the windrow. So it's really in the windrow, it's reacting like a 20-1. So now what we have to do is we have to actually put a windrow together that's closer to maybe 38 or 40-1. So when those 10 do not react, we still have a net result of 30-1. We call that effective 30-1 ratio. And so that's one factor we have to look at. Second thing is, in terms of materials that we're looking for, those ingredients, the improper ingredients, is when some of the ingredients are old material. They have already decomposed largely, not altogether, but they have perhaps no longer have a lot more reaction in them. And if we're looking at some of those materials as too large of a percentage, it may simply slow down our reaction. And so what do we mean by reaction? Folks, heat does not come from the manure of microbes breaking things down. Heat comes from the things coming out of the organic matter cells. And once they are no longer in the organic matter cells, they end up being very reactive. And so we're trying to make sure it's clear that the materials have to be properly structured in your windrow. I'm saying like the proper percentage and the proper material preparation. So I'm now transitioning to the proper preparation of ingredients. And again, this is part of this pitfall of improper ingredients as well as improper preparation of the ingredients. So to make sure that our ingredients are prepared properly, we have to have both the carbons and the nitrogens matched in terms of getting equally soaked into the interior of the particle, not just the exterior. It's fine and dandy to have it wet on the outside of your wood or your straw, but how about having it soaked into the inside so that it's soft all the way down through? And that's what ends up actually rotting is once the cells are wet, they end up rotting. And so this is a decomposition or rotting project. So we have to properly prepare the material so that both the carbons and the nitrogens are thoroughly wet all the way throughout into the internal of each particle. Our second pitfall that we're looking at is the lack of capturing the volatile compounds. I have a story. In this story, I'm going to try to demonstrate what happens. There was a Flemish physician back in the 1800s who put together a study. He planted a 5-pound tree in a 200 pounds, exact 200 pounds of soil, and watered that tree for 5 years. Did not put on any fertilizer, but he did water it for 5 years, and then he carefully dug the tree out of that 200 pounds of soil, cleaned off the dirt off of the roots, and weighed the soil again. In each case, he started with 200 pounds, and the tree started at 5 pounds. But once he had it all out, the tree now weighed 164 pounds. That means that it had gained 159 pounds. 164 minus 5 equals 159. That 159-pound tree should have taken 159 pounds out of the 200 pounds of soil, right? The answer is no. It only took out 2 ounces of soil. Now, in that 159 pounds of tree gain, it did get some water, so that's where some of the weight is, but not nearly all of the cellulose material in that tree is water by any stretch of the imagination. It in fact has other things in it, such as lignin and so on. So where did all that weight come from when 2 ounces came from the soil? That's it. 2 ounces from the soil means that we've got the rest of the weight coming from the atmospheric air and the sun. And here's the point I want to make. Of the 159 pounds times 16 ounces to a pound, that amount of ounces is 2,544 ounces. 2,544 ounces times minus the 2 ounces of what came out of the soil means that 2,542 came from the sun and the atmospheric air. What we have discovered is when you compost that tree down, that 159 pounds, most of it wants to go back up in the air where it came from. Since all of that growth came from things that are lighter than air, when that decomposes, it goes back up into the air, just like a gas that's lighter than air, such as helium gas in a gas balloon. The balloon goes up since the air inside it is lighter than the outside air. And this causes things to want to go up. And so we have discovered that to make humus, we've got to capture those volatile compounds, that stuff that's lighter than air. And we use clay soil to mix with these materials because we recognize that this clay has a negative attraction to itself, and when that stuff starts leaking out of the cells, it's lighter than air. On its way going out into the atmospheric air, it gets grabbed onto by this clay particle, and then it gets held onto that clay colloid until the microbes can come back and use it. In other words, the clay becomes a temporary pantry of the volatile compounds coming out of the decomposing organic matter. Secondly, we also end up using an inoculant that puts out an enzyme. So when it gets against decomposing organic matter, it puts out a material on the outside of the microbe bodies that we call an enzyme. Other people can also call it an absorbent. But this type of microbe that we use in the inoculant called N converter, those enzymes are also strongly attractive to themselves. In other words, they put out negative ions that pulls the volatile compounds to itself. So now we have 2 things we do to capture our materials in the windrow. The first is the clay, and the second is our inoculant. So we will now advance to the third pitfall that often people actually miss, and thus miss the goal of making humus. This is called improper moisture management. This third one is. And the moisture management of the windrow comes from not managing the material throughout the windrow properly. However, it is a rather difficult topic to teach because the perception of most people is when it's a wet, damp pile, the windrow, they kind of just think, okay, it's wet enough. But when you really dig into it, are there any carbon materials there that are kind of dry, and then right beside it, it's kind of wet? If so, that's something that you really have to watch. And so we end up looking at what we can do to make so that can happen. So anyhow, we make sure that the material in the moisture aspect is very thorough and completely even, homogeneously throughout the windrow, but also all the way to the interior parts of the organic matter. That's moisture management at its best. The lack of proper moisture of each ingredient sets you up for trouble. So, and again, before we put down the windrow, the different ingredients have to possibly be pre-soaked to make this even work. That's one piece. Or in some cases, the manure is just really, really wet and the carbon is really, really dry. And the difference between the two is that those two materials do not work well together. So what we have to do in a case like we have too much moisture in our manure or the nitrogen pieces and not enough moisture on the carbon, we have to bring the carbons up in moisture so that it much closer matches the excessive manure of the or moisture of the manure. When you have something that's powder and something that's wet mud, for example, they diametrically oppose each other. So you have to get the dry a little damp for it to accept more moisture. So this is part of this aspect of setting yourself up for success in getting the materials all covered with moisture. Also, one more piece on moisture management, and that is not covering the windrow. If you do cover it with a fabric, you'll have the moisture stay moist from one day to the next, all the way out to almost the complete edge of that windrow. Otherwise, in a hot, dry day, it can dry out to 1 to 2, 3 inches deep. Maybe I should rephrase that to say more like a half an inch to 1 inch deep. And the next day you'll turn in that dry material and disrupt your entire biological process. So we do have to keep that windrow moist. And we actually also encourage using a spray boom so we can spray the outside before we turn anything in case there is something on the outside that's dry. We want to make sure that we have that moist. And so that kind of brings you up to speed with the third pitfall. We're now advancing to the fourth, and that is about not managing the heat process properly. Now, this is really a key thing to monitor and manage. And when we're doing that, we're going to be talking about several different things. Heat comes from things coming out of organic matter cells, no longer bonded together, but when they get outside the cell and they touch things, they react. It is very much like an A-B process in epoxy glue. The A, if you put it out on a cardboard by itself, does not react. It just sits there and eventually dries up, but nothing fast. The B, if you put it separately out there on a cardboard, it does this exact same thing. It just sits there, does not react. The minute you put the A and the B together in an epoxy glue, it ends up becoming hot and hard. And this is the stuff that you got to think about when you're managing your heat. Inside the cell, the stuff does not react, but you get the cell wall soft with moisture and a little bit of pressure that comes from the static pressure of the windrow, it starts softening up the cell walls. When the cell wall busts open, out come the ingredients inside each little ball or cell wall. And when they come out, they're no longer affixated. Now they're potentially reactive. Inside every cell, there's a nitrogen component and a carbon component. And when they come out of that cell, those two ingredients want to react and cause a reaction or a mini explosion, if you will. And that's where heat is then expressed. And so this is how you manage your heat process. If it's not hot enough in your windrows, you know it's not reacting properly. Now, part of this can come from always maintain in the beginning 4 or 5 weeks of your windrow a large-sized windrow. Part of it's becoming to be sure that you have reactive materials and not too many old materials, as I mentioned earlier. So we want to make sure that in that first 1 to 4 or 5 weeks that we maintain this bottom number of 131 degrees up to about 160 degree range, in that 131 to 160 range. And so if you look at it, we have to have the right amount of reaction to make that heat. But let's say that the windrow gets too hot. Well, we have found if you add even a little more clay than our normal recommended of 10 to 12%, maybe go up to 15%, you can cool that windrow that's too hot back down. So that's part of our thing about the too high. If it's not high enough, we know that we probably haven't properly soaked up the materials and or we have a wrong effective CN ratio, as I mentioned earlier. So this is a big piece of it, but remember, in the first week or two, the shrink is pretty fast, and so you got to then start shortening up the windrows, and we build 2 at a time so that we start by the second and third week, we're already combining those windrows, and eventually it becomes 1 windrow. So for an example, one day it's 1 1/2 windrows, the next day it's 1 1/3 windrow, the next day it's 1 1/4 windrow, and the next day it's maybe just a 1 1/10 of a windrow, and then finally it's all just combined into 1 windrow that used to be 2, as an example. So now we're advancing to pitfall number 5, and that's not to be able to handle every particle separately with a compost turner. Not every compost turner handles every particle separately. I cannot emphasize this enough. For example, some concepts out there are that if the turner is partially a shredder, that's a good thing. Well, I happen to believe that it's a very good thing the very first pass, but the next passes that you can make in making humus, you're going to do 20 to 30 passes. You're going to beat it up and make it fine like talcum powder and no longer have any air pass through it. Now you won't make any humus. So we can't have drum in the compost turner that's acting like a shredder. That's first thing. Second is we have to have a drum that thoroughly mixes everything so that everything touches everything else. It's a ability to homogeneously mix thoroughly every particle so it can go back and forth. The next piece that I want to talk about that turner, when it's in the air, it needs to be separating the particles apart so that each particle separates from each other. And those things of not only from a big picture mix up together, the inside becomes the outside and the outside of the windrow becomes the inside. You not only want to do that, but in the process you want to separate all the particles apart so that you can apply water to every particle, have air pass through each particle. You can end up inoculating every particle, capture every particle with your inoculant, spraying on every particle so that when those cells do bust open, again, it's just simply a must that the turner handles every particle separately. And from my perspective, the Aeromaster was designed to handle every particle separately first. That was the main goal, and the beautiful aspect of that, by the way, is that it ended up accidentally, without us knowing it will do that, requiring much, much less horsepower, therefore less breakdown, less fuel costs, and less frustration, etc. Now we're going to go and advance into limitation number 6, or the pitfall number 6 that keeps people from producing humus compost. And that's not having the right inoculants that actually builds together a protein. I'm talking about a microbe that puts things together. Almost all microbes that end up working with what people are working with, such as biologicals to soils and compost starters, they call it, that they hope to makes it compost windrow hotter. That's not what we want. We are not looking at an inoculant to make things decompose better. We're looking at 3 inoculants. The first one keeps it from getting lost, so the ingredients are held until you can then use your second inoculant, which we have one that's called humifier. It's the humus-making microbe, and that ends up making humus, and that particular microbe is simply putting things together. And what does it eat? It only can put things together that are lighter than air. The volatile compounds that are held on to the clay colloid and onto the enzyme of the N converter inoculant is its food source. So without clay and without that first inoculant, you are wasting your money to put this inoculant in there. Remember, this second inoculant is not designed to break anything down. It's designed to build things back together. It's taking many pieces and putting them into larger pieces that are put together, not the opposite way around. So that's first thing I want to really drive home when we're using the right inoculants is, A, you need to have the food source, and B, you need to have the right inoculant so that it can do its thing in building a humus protein. Lastly, the last inoculant is to simply react with the second inoculant to cause the second inoculant to build a stronger protein. We have discovered that all humus compost needs to have weak and medium and very strong strength humus proteins, and so that's why that third inoculant is in there. So let me rephrase that and just summarize the inoculants. The first one is to capture things. The second one is to feed on the things that are captured and put them into a protein, and the third one is to strengthen that humus protein into a stronger protein. All right, so that then advances us to the last pitfall, which is the improper process of windrow management. And now I'm talking about several things, and I'm going to lay them out very methodically. The improper process means that you're not paying attention to these things I'm going to lay out. And that is, you're not consistently managing your carbon dioxide buildup. 70% of all organic matter puts out CO2 when it rots, so it will have CO2. It's your task to get oxygen back in. So how about reading it before you turn it? And it says, yes, it's full of CO2 and doesn't have oxygen. Okay, so that tells us over 10% CO2 tells us we need to turn it, for example. Then when you do turn it, if the CO2 doesn't go down, we haven't done the right job. So we have to have a reading afterwards that says, yes, we've got the air back into it and the CO2 out of it. So that's one piece. The second piece is we've got to be recording our temperatures. So CO2 and temperatures, that's one piece. Then the next step is we've got to combine these windrows as soon as we can, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about managing the heat. But we've got to manage these windrows so that, A, they are clean. We're scraping the sides of the windrows. Every time we turn it, we go along and we kind of scrape alongside because we realize that those compost windrows are a triangle. And what I call the apex, or where the triangle meets the ground on each side of the windrow, that last 2-3 inches of the apex there, it's not hot at all. So we have to go along and scrape that up with a loader bucket and put it on top of the windrow so next time it gets turned in. We have to do those things so that we stay sanitized. We stay a good product and not have any of those pathogens remain through, because remember, weed seeds and pathogens can lay there on the side of the windrow down against the ground and never get warm enough and moist enough to actually decompose and do what it needs to do. So While the main part of your windrow may be doing well, you've got to take care of the entire windrow. Lastly, on this proper windrow management, not only do we want to combine it when necessary, every 3 weeks or 4, we need to move it off its own base and onto a new base. I cannot always explain why that works. I just know that really does work, and I really want to make sure that you get that. And so in summary, in terms of managing the windrow, you're producing a product that goes from a value of whatever manure or compost is in your area to something that's 10 to 20 times more valuable for the farmer. And so these are the details that makes it work, and you can say, well, I do not know if I want to go through that effort. Since it's that detailed, I think I'll just make regular compost. And I want to end up with one quick story. 16 years, one of our customers made regular compost. He had sticky red clay soil. When he started finally after the 16th year making humus compost, 2 years later, that red clay soil one day received 8.5 inches of rain, and yet 6 inches down, it was still well granulated. You didn't even get sticky shoes out there the day after the 8.5 inches of rain. Humus compost makes a huge difference, expands soils, help balance soils, etc. And so with that, I'd just like to summarize this to say thank you very much for your call. Just wanted to be sure that people could listen to this call so they can avoid those 7 pitfalls and end up making humus compost predictively time after time. Thank you very much for your time.